Welcome to the Education Corner, a podcast by Education Choices magazine.
Education Corner podcast would like to welcome Mr. Jules Hall, founder and CEO of Ultra Education, which primarily works with children and young people, regardless of their background or social standing, to enable them to have access to essential entrepreneurial education. He also founded AskUltra, which offers A1-powered chatbot tuition for children, and has also written 3 books, including Entrepreneur to Ultrapreneur. We're thrilled to welcome you to our Education Corner podcast. Our first question is, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background before you became CEO of Ultra Education?
Well, hello, Chloe, and thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. I've been really looking forward to having this chat with you. Before I became CEO of Ultra Education, what was I doing? Seems like such a long time ago now. I was doing something. I had a career in investment banking. Prior to that, I had run a number of businesses when I was much younger. And just before I had started the education company, I ran a digital marketing agency in Shoreditch. So I'd done a number of different things which kind of influenced and informed a lot of the work that we do now. So I started my first business. It was a fashion business with some friends of mine when I was in my late teens. But because there was no mentors or access to networks of individuals that could help me with my entrepreneurial ideas, none of the businesses that I started or ran would go past the kind of 12-month period. So I did what I thought was the sensible thing that everyone was doing, which was just to go and get a job. And the other thing that I was really passionate about was technology back then. I still am. And so I managed to get myself onto the corporate ladder on the technology side of things, and then ended up in investment banking doing that. And that was great. There was no reason for me to leave or to think about leaving, except that I remembered what it was like doing my own thing and being an entrepreneur and having that autonomy just to dream and create, and you'd see what you could do with it, just see what was possible. But being in a corporate job, you have a very strict job description that you typically can't go out of. You're not sure about your career prospects and all of that. I didn't really feel like I was in control. So I took the leap. I raised some money from GLA actually at the time, which was now back in 2006. And with some colleagues of mine, we started a digital agency in Shoreditch, which then grew into being more of a kind of business consultancy, which had a really strong digital thread behind it. Yeah, and we ran that successfully for a number of years through the credit crunch. They call it something different now, but that was quite enriching, learned loads. And then I split from my partners in that business and essentially was a solo entrepreneur for a number of years, wrote some books, travels, did a lot of speaking. And then all of those experiences wrapped up kind of informed the work that I'm doing now.
Such an interesting history. And we understand also that you attended Latimer Upper School. Do you feel that that has helped you have the confidence to develop your ideas and passions for entrepreneurship?
Yeah, great question. So I kind of reflected, given I run an education company, on my own education and how that has maybe influenced or supported what I'm doing now. And I think that what I gained from going to Latimer Upper School was having the capability to do what I'm doing, not necessarily the confidence. And the reason why I make the distinction is because I don't look back at my schooling and feel as if I had gained confidence because of my education experience. But what it did do was it did make me feel as if I was presented with a problem or something that I didn't know how to, that I had the capability to approach it. And I guess you might call that growth mindset. So I looked at things as if, well, I was able to work out some really difficult things in school academically. So I could apply that to almost anything. The confidence bit, I think, came from me being able to execute on the unknown, meaning if I had an idea for a business and there's a bunch of assumptions around it, you don't know if it's going to work. My confidence grew really slowly as an entrepreneur. I didn't have that confidence straight away. I had to go through success and failure and then small steps which could represent success through achieving things, I guess. And that came much later. So the confidence came much later. But I think what I had from an earlier age, which I think that education at Latimer gave me, was the idea that I was capable of doing these things. I was capable of, if I hadn't done marketing before, didn't know how to do PR, or I didn't know how to start a new IT system for the business, if I didn't know how to do it, at least I believed that I was capable of doing it. And for me, that is almost as important as confidence, because you can be confident, but you may not actually do anything with it. Whereas because I believed that I had the capability, it meant that I would try new things. I would try new and different things, and I would do it really quickly without having to overthink things or worry about if I was going to get it wrong. I felt as if I could just give it a go.
So some level risk taking as well.
Yeah, I think so. That's actually a good point. So I think that the belief I had in my capability meant that I would take on bigger risks, because I believed that the risk would be minimized because I was capable. And so the more things I did that proved that, then the more things I would do. So I would then take on bigger risks and bigger risks, because I thought, well, it worked last time, and it didn't always work the next time. But then I would always default to, what did I learn from that, as opposed to, woe is me, it didn't work. I thought, well, what did I learn from that? Because I'm going to be doing this again at some point. So what did I learn, and what could I use the next time?
Sure, they told you that making mistakes are good learning, or the best learning in their time. What motivated you to set up Ultra Education, or what was your inspiration behind it?
So a couple of things. So there was a kind of micro example and a macro example. The micro example was that when my daughter was about 6 years old, this was in the phase of me being solo entrepreneur, consultant, business coach, that kind of thing. So when she was born, and when she was just a toddler growing up, in my home office, she would have a little play area. And whenever the phone would ring, she would know to be quiet. And I would just be working away, doing my thing, and she'd be there. And we had this little thing going on. And then when we were doing the weekly shop, we were in the supermarket, and she was in my arms, and she said, "Oh, Daddy, what's that guy doing? What's that man doing?" And it was someone stacking the shelves. And I said, "Oh, well, he's stacking the shelves. He's putting the food on the shelves, so we know where they are." She said, "Why is he doing that?" I said, "Well, that's because that's his job. That's what he does for work." And she said, "No, Daddy, someone's job is when they're on their computer and they're having meetings and they're writing books and they're designing stuff." And she was describing me. She was describing what I do for work. And she couldn't, in her mind, resolve why this guy was doing something different for work, where Daddy was doing what he does for work. And she was describing what an entrepreneur does, what a business person does. So that was her first idea of what work was. It was what I did. And as she described it, I thought, well, okay, you've obviously been, as any child would, right, absorbing what's going on in your environment. But this was my first experience of how children learn. At that time, I had no inclination to think about doing a business in education. But when I saw what she had picked up, and then maybe a couple of months later, we had some friends around, we were all in the garden, and then she came to the patio doors with her cousins and said, "Right, everyone, we've made you all stuff to buy. And if you don't have any money, we've made you credit cards too." And everyone looked at me and said, "What have you been teaching this poor child? She'd just be playing with toys, and you've been teaching her entrepreneurship." And I hadn't been teaching her anything. I hadn't mentioned a word about entrepreneurship or business to her at all at 7 years old. But again, she had absorbed what I was doing, and she was replaying it. She was playing it out, as children do. But people thought that I was teaching her this stuff explicitly. So I was inspired by the idea that a child, without being explicitly taught something, could pick it up. And I thought, well, that's great for my daughter, but then what about everyone else? And my wife is an early years teacher. She's been teaching early years for quite some time. And so she kind of helped me to realize that early years education is more impactful. A lot more can happen than people think. And this was demonstrated through my daughter. So on a macro level, one of the things that motivated me to teaching entrepreneurship to children was that two things happened. As an entrepreneur and in working with other peers of mine who were entrepreneurs, I realized that one of the limiting factors for entrepreneurs was mindset. It wasn't about the business, because setting up a business and making it successful, it's not rocket science. If you follow some basic things, it's something that almost anyone can do. But then the question becomes, well, then why isn't everyone successful, and why do so many businesses fail? And my conclusion was that it wasn't because of the mechanics of entrepreneurship. It wasn't because of the step-by-step stuff you've got to do. It was because of the mindset, and it was because of the limiting beliefs that entrepreneurs would embody, which often comes from an early age. So I thought, well, if we teach entrepreneurship to children at an earlier age, would that make them more successful? Would that increase the rate of success for entrepreneurs in general? So this idea that 9 out of 10 entrepreneurs fail, I mean, that's not a welcoming statistic for anyone. So I thought, well, do 9 out of 10 entrepreneurs fail because the concept is introduced essentially in adult life? And if we introduced it to children and they had their childhood and their teenage years to get their head around it, would they be more successful? And so those were the two things that inspired me to start.
Can you tell us a little bit then further to that? Obviously, you have gone into education in a big way. You were the entrepreneur in residence at Putney High for a while. What work it is that you're implementing in primary and secondary schools?
The work we're implementing in schools today, it forms a number of different programs, and sometimes it's going in and reinforcing an area of learning that's already happening. You might go in and take over PSHE, or we might go over and take over design and tech or literacy, or it could be an area of enrichment, it could be an after-school club. So usually entrepreneurship or kind of entrepreneurial skills development, we kind of use it as a tool in schools to either plug gaps or to teach it as a topic on its own. So sometimes when students are signing up for business studies, for example, they think that business studies is going to help them to start a business, which you would naturally think. But actually it doesn't. Business studies isn't about how to set up a business. It's studying other businesses. And often those businesses are so grand, they're so big and lofty and have been around for so many decades. As a student, you can't really pull anything useful or actionable from that study. So now we go in and often deliver what a student would expect to be business studies. How do I set up a business, right? I'm 16, 15, I want to set up a business. How do I actually do that? So we'll go in and do those dedicated lessons and programs and workshops. So it takes that form, or a teacher might see that actually this could be a really good way to get learning outcomes for some of my other lessons. Could be maths, could be English, could be even history, right? These ways in which we can angle entrepreneurship to serve a number of different subjects and help teachers achieve other learning outcomes. So we use it in a multifaceted way, which keeps the work interesting for us, but it also shows the diversity of approach that you can take with entrepreneurial education.
Fantastic. And I'm assuming that you go into both maintained and independent schools.
Yes, we do, yeah.
Why do you think then that entrepreneurship is so important as a part of education? I mean, you talked about business, and obviously people can study business through to university, but do you think it's an argument that there should be the option of taking a GCSE in entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial skills?
Yeah, so the debate, particularly, I think, in entrepreneurial circles around how entrepreneurship sits in education has been an interesting one, because on one end of the spectrum, some people will say you can't teach entrepreneurship. On the other end of the spectrum, they'll say that you can teach it, but then the debate is what form does it take? Because if you wrap it up into a qualification, that would mean exams, and exams means a very standardized way of learning and delivering a particular subject, which entrepreneurs don't like. Entrepreneurs don't like the idea of standardizing their approach because they see it as very kind of wild, wild west, shoot from the hip and all the rest of it. But in reality, it isn't really like that. So the idea of a Lord Sugar or a Richard Branson, leaving school, no qualifications, become a millionaire, that is often the exception. It's not the norm in entrepreneurship. You know, most entrepreneurs finish school. Most entrepreneurs still are engaged in some form of learning. But on the flip side, it is useful to know, and it is the case that if you do not fit within the traditional form of education, that you can access entrepreneurship, right? So that does exist there too. So to answer your question, entrepreneurship in education is important because it is a part of real life. The vast majority of the UK economy is based on small to medium-sized enterprises. They're on our high streets, they're on our mobile phones, we buy from them, they employ millions and millions of people, and they form parts of our communities and our ecosystems. But knowing how to do that isn't accessible until adult life. And so we're missing out a massive chunk of opportunity in helping children and young people to understand how they can set up their own businesses if it's not in education. It's just such an essential part of whether it's the UK economy or an essential part of how you consider what your career could be without discussing that. It just feels like it's just a huge chunk of real life that's missing. Secondly, and this was kind of wrapped up in a 2014 report called Enterprise for All, which was published by Lord Young and a group of enterprise educators, which coined this idea of a fourth R. So you've got reading, writing, arithmetic, and then relevance, which said that enterprise and entrepreneurship and the education behind it is a really good way to make core academics relevant. I'm sure there's a student right now sitting in class thinking, how is this relevant to my life? I mean, no matter what the topic is, I'm sure someone's sitting there right now thinking, how am I going to ever use this, right? And so what enterprise and entrepreneurial education does is it kind of helps to bridge the gap between, okay, this is what you're learning today, and this is how it could be applied in the working world, whether that's working for someone else or working for yourself. The reason why that's important is because we know that there's a skills gap in the UK, which is essentially the gap between what young people leave education with, whether that's in sixth form, college or university. So the skill set they leave with, and then what employers are looking for. We know there's a gap. And so entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial education helps to fill that gap really nicely, because you get to learn about businesses, you get to learn about what it is to set one up, what it is to run one, and all the things that go around that, which then help you make that transition into the working world a lot easier.
Could be argued, couldn't it, that it's life skills in general as well as entrepreneurship, how to change a tyre, how to cope when you run out of petrol, how to budget weekly for your shopping. It all somehow becomes a big part of the gap between doing English, maths and physics and science and then real life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where you find individuals like myself will differentiate between entrepreneurship and an entrepreneurial skill set and an entrepreneurial mindset. Because entrepreneurship is more about the exercise of starting your own business and all the rest of it. But an entrepreneurial mindset and a skill set can be applied to life in general. So I think you're absolutely right.
On the Ultra Education website, it states that the work you do is focused on those from Black and ethnic minority communities and those for whom the existing education system does not deliver. Why do you think that this is the case? You know, social mobility is a big issue in the UK. Why do you think this is an ongoing problem as a first world country?
So as an example, and this is super relevant to me, and I didn't know this up until just a few years back. So I was born and raised in Brent, which is northwest London, and both of my parents are from the Caribbean. Now, statistically, boys of Caribbean heritage born in Brent are academically some of the lowest performing in the country. And this has been the case for a while. So given that I'm that demographic, but I have probably increased my life chances by 10 or 20 times, what is it that I've done that's been different? And I believe the difference was my experience with entrepreneurship. I believe it gave me a mindset and a skill set that essentially helped me to increase my life chances. Unfortunately, that statistic still ranges true. I mean, it's decades old. It's still the issue now. And there are lots of other underrepresented communities and individuals who may be neurodiverse. And, you know, we all know the statistics. Even if you want to start a business or you want to have a rock star career, we know that if you're female, you get less than 1% of VC funding. You're not going to be on board. You know, these are barriers that we see and we have in society. So for us, the focus is on helping those individuals through race, gender, or other barriers to circumvent them. And it just so happens entrepreneurship is a really good way of doing that. There are other ways too, but entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial thinking and skill set can help either for you to leap over those barriers or to overcome them or to pick yourself up if you fall prey to them. If you ask what's the reason, it is structural bias, structural racism, which has caused all of this. I think post the murder of George Floyd and BLM, there's a lot more information sharing and knowledge about why all of this stuff exists. And so there's a lot of work being done to challenge those barriers, the unconscious bias. As an example, we know that Black boys there's an adultification of them in school. So teachers will look at boys of that age and treat them as if they're adults. They'll punish them as if they were adults. There'll be a bias against them because of that reason. And so all of these challenges we found ourselves in the middle of, not because of design, it's just because of who we've been, the communities that we've been working in, and the seeming benefit that entrepreneurship can have in helping to address, support and leapfrog some of these challenges. And that's been our view on it.
Very interesting. We've met at the House of Lords a couple of times discussing entrepreneurship in education. How do you think that schools and universities can support young people further to develop and take the risks that obviously any form of entrepreneurial ideas or entrepreneurship requires?
So I think there's still a level of understanding which is needed by education in general to see where entrepreneurship fits. There is still a disconnection between what it means to be an entrepreneur or be in business and education. They seem to still clash a lot. Very forward-thinking schools like Putney will identify that actually there is a core relationship between the two and there is an essential need for their students to understand it. Schools who don't necessarily have the capacity and the resources of a Putney, loads of the other schools do recognize it, but again, they don't necessarily have someone who can be dedicated to it. They don't necessarily have the funding to be able to pay for programs and so on. And so from the point of view of the Department for Education, they would say, because they've said it to me in the past and actually in the recent past, that, and their view is that schools and teachers are given the enough room and autonomy within the national curriculum to teach this. That would be their response. And that they are encouraged to teach financial literacy and entrepreneurship in lessons like PSHE and others. And I guess my response to that is that teachers and schools aren't measured on that. So, if they're not measured on it, they're not going to perform well on it. And those subjects are still very badly resourced. So teachers, they don't know how to teach it and there aren't enough resources, then they're not going to be able to do it. I also think that the more subtle but important dynamic is particularly in lower income areas. If the teachers don't believe the students can do it, then they probably won't teach it. If the teachers have a low expectation of student outcomes, then they'll teach to that level. And so I think that examples of entrepreneurs who don't come from, middle-class backgrounds and that entrepreneurship can be accessed by anyone, I think is needed to widen or open the eyes of teachers so they can see that it's possible too. Just because someone's not born in the right postcode doesn't mean that they don't have the capability to start their own business.
You're probably missing an awful lot of talent currently.
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. In the corporate world, it's exactly that. There is a lack of diverse talent within corporates, and not just for gender and ethnicity's sake, but they realize that if there is a greater diversity within their talent pools, then there's a greater diversity of thought that goes into the business, which makes them more effective and more competitive in the landscape that they exist. So that penny has dropped for corporates a number of years back. The challenge that they've got now is in actually attracting that pool of talent who wouldn't consider, because those barriers have been up for so long, the pool of talent that they're trying to get to wouldn't even consider them as an employer because they wouldn't think that they'd be valued, right? So now it's a different challenge.
As a magazine, we focus on the educational aspects. We've had some fantastic speakers, including Dr. Sandy Okoro, who's a big voice for diversity and a champion of inclusion and diversity and equity, alongside people like David Muley from Cranleigh School in Surrey, who talked about his journey and the challenges he's faced going into education as a Black man. And yes, I think even schools are beginning to recognise that they need to be more inclusive and have a more diverse staff, but sometimes it's often that people have the mindset that they're not actually qualified or suitable or would fit in that community. you've written 3 books. Do you want to tell us a little bit about these?
Yeah, sure. So the first book I wrote was at the end of my life as an entrepreneur in the digital marketing space. And that was called 10 Secrets of Social Media Marketing. And that book was written in 2010. And that actually was the book which kind of sparked my then career or side hustle even as a speaker. So that book was picked up and put me on a speaking tour, probably for the next few years, actually, which was great. So I went on and spoke in a number of different countries on the topic of innovation, entrepreneurship, digital media. Then the second book I wrote was Entrepreneur to Ultrapreneur, which essentially was a book of kind of motivational quotes, because I know entrepreneurs don't have time to read. So it was a book of motivational quotes that were helpful to me that I thought entrepreneurs would benefit from. And then the last book I wrote was How to Start a Tech Startup, which was just me trying to compact the step-by-step process that you would use to, start a tech company back then.
Fantastic. And finally, what's your vision for the future of entrepreneurship in education going forwards?
I remember when I was asked this question a few years back, and at the time, my answer was that entrepreneurship would be on the curriculum. And the interviewer said, well, if entrepreneurship's on the curriculum, then you'd be out of a job, wouldn't you? And I said, well, I'm an entrepreneur. I'm sure I can figure something else out. And now my response wouldn't necessarily be that entrepreneurship is just on the curriculum, but that, as our mission statement is, we want to be in a world where effective entrepreneurial education is available and accessible by children everywhere. So whether they are in a state school, independent school, primary school, they're in a PRU, they're in an alternative provision, they're homeschooled. In the same way, if a child wants to learn Spanish or they want to learn maths or something, there's so many resources out there that they could just pick up. You could pick it up anyway. It's very widely available. Most subjects are very, very widely available, extremely well resourced. There's stuff you could pick up from school, from YouTube, from the internet. But you can't say the same for entrepreneurship or financial literacy. If you're 10 years old or you're 15 years old or whatever, and you want to learn about entrepreneurship, then you can't just reach out and grab a resource. It's not as easy to do. And that for me would be our vision, is for that child or young person who wakes up one day and says, you know what, I've got an idea for a business, or I've been running a business, but I need to find out how I can grow my team, learn about marketing, know whether I should pivot. And they would know where to go to, or there'd be a quick search they could make and they could pull the information that they needed to be able to carry on with their journey.
Or even the advice.
Or even just the advice, yeah. So in the same way, within grown-up entrepreneurial community, there are places you can go to get advice, right? But if you're a student, then, where would you go to get something that the same ecosystems don't exist? And I think, having that there available to them, I think would just be of a huge value.
Such an interesting conversation. Thank you so much for featuring on our Education Corner podcast. And I look forward to hearing more about your exciting journey. Thank you so much for giving up your time, Jules.
Thank you so much for having me, Chloe.